Hi everyone, I am Dr. Tia Kansara and I'll be hosting this live brought to you by Replenish Earth. Joining me today is Guy-Philippe Goldstein, an absolute futurist that for me is a person I can speak to for hours. I adore him deeply and I'm totally entertained. We can sort of improv conversations in ways that one would never expect. We'll be exploring the future of replenishing Earth from the perspective of a futurist. What is the future of the planet? Should we be afraid? How might we prepare for the nightmares that have yet to come? Guy-Philippe Goldstein is an anticipation fiction writer and a cyber defense specialist. Very interesting. His debut novel, Babel Minute Zero, is a thriller on cyber warfare and has attracted the attention of cyber researchers all across the world, in particular in France at MIT and among members of the Israeli government as well. He is a lecturer at the School of Economic Warfare in Paris and advises PwC on cyber defense issues and prospective scenarios. So without further ado, I welcome you, Guy-Philippe. How are you
Hi,
doing?
Tia. How are you? Great to see you.
I know, right? Like it's been forever.
Yeah.
It feels like it, at least. You're in Paris right now?
Absolutely.
Got you. And
Great
feels like a sort of a good, library behind you. Have you read all of these books, by the way?
Absolutely not. Some of that is shared with my girlfriend. There's actually a little, hidden ad here for my latest essay. I cannot direct that properly, which is basically on
If you do
cyber
the
defense.
dancing like
this one, okay, with a little blue man.
Oh,
It's
I
in
see it.
French.
What a beautiful way of like secretly putting
Cyber
in the
defense and cyber power was published at the perfect best time in Paris on March 2020, right at the moment where you have the whole COVID thing. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that. I'm going to try to republish it somehow.
Yeah, exactly. I think we'd all be very, very interested in knowing some of your thoughts. And, when we came together for, the conversation at BOMA in March, we were really at the beginning of recognizing what the pandemic was going to be, and subsequently have had so much experience in pulling different strands, trying to understand what's happening around the world, getting kind of a global view of both the pandemic, but also in relationship with what these sort of nightmare scenarios can teach us. So, one of the more pressing things, especially with the fires in California at the minute, is what is the future of the planet? Should we really be afraid? What do you think, Guy?
So it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. The key thing is what should we be afraid, and for whom? Your show is Replenish Earth, basically, and so the main question would be: should Earth in itself, Gaia, should that planet be afraid? And for Earth, Gaia, that system, my answer will be no, not at all. And that may seem a bit surprising, but when you look and you take a wider, big perspective on whatever happened on this planet over the last 5 billion years, and especially over the last 500, 600 million years, till you had the explosion of life starting 550 million years ago, you already had about 5 major mass extinctions events, moments where you had about 75 to even 96% of all species on the planet disappearing. With actually sometimes an amount of energy being released in some of those events, which is, absolutely without comparison to whatever we human beings are able to project. I give you one example. The last big one, 66 million years ago, the one that made the dinosaurs disappear, the estimated amount of energy that was produced, when you had these big comets that went near Mexico, was about 300 billion times the amount of energy released at Hiroshima. 300 billion times.
I can't even almost imagine that.
Right.
That's, Hiroshima left, many of the Japanese thinking that for decades, if not forever, nothing would grow on the land of Hiroshima. Of course, today we see, a beautiful peace park and the Genbaku Dome sort of memorial, etc. But the consequences of such mass extinction because of the complications that had been created, and as you said, as many of these sorts of processes have happened before, the Earth still continues.
Yeah, that's the key point. Earth in itself as an ecosystem is actually quite resilient. So far, the Anthropocene mass extinction, whatever we are generating that destroy a species, we may have, we're risking and threatening the survival of about 1 out of 8 species. That's about 12, 13%. Yeah, that's significant for sure. And if we continue on that track, that's going to be even more significant. But again, it's nothing to be compared with a massive mass extinction that happened on this planet. And then, if you just take one grander view, of nature, nature in itself doesn't stop just at the planet, at this Gaia, at Earth. If you look at the cosmos, we have 10 to the power of 20 billion stars. We don't know how many planets there is with each of those stellar systems. But one can imagine that actually there's a wide number of other, areas with, lots of development of what we would call nature. So, so just to put in a nutshell, Earth in itself has a high chance, and when we mean Earth, we mean all the living ecosystems. The fact that Earth as a planet will be a living ecosystem, there's a high chance that it's going to survive whatever happens to us. But the key thing is, for us, Homo sapiens sapiens, are we going to be able to maintain a sustainable environment for us to continue as a species to survive? And that question actually is the big one for us. And in as much as I'm quite positive that Earth, will continue to exist as a living ecosystem, if we go back and move forward 1 billion years from now, I'm not at all positive for our species, unfortunately. And there are many different reasons. And of course, the way we are transforming our planet, we're transforming the ecosystem, and we do see all the different shocks that it creates. Of course, we see the shocks with regard to global warming. We see the shocks, we mentioned the COVID pandemic. We see how much we encroach into other living organisms. And actually, there's lots of studies that show that we have had an increase in frequency of different epidemic outbreaks over the last 30 years because mankind does encroach even more into other living territories that are sometimes reservoirs for viruses that we don't know. And so we do see that increase in the number of epidemic outbreaks. And that creates our own activity, basically, is creating a very volatile environment, of course, of a sort of a race between whatever we do in the name of technological progress, but of course that creates imbalances in all different kinds and also in all kinds of different type of exposure. Actually, it's what you see, basically, it's the whole calculus that you see in cybersecurity.
Right.
I'm a cyber defense now kind of expert starting from fiction because when I started to write my debut novel, Babel Minute Zero, was back actually 25 years ago, nearly 25 years ago. And that stemmed from a very obvious fact that we are going to increase our IT computer means, and that is going to encroach and transform our life in a large and significant way. But
at the time, we did, there was no way that we could have known that. Like, there's no way that we could have been prepared for what was then to come. I mean, I remember when I was in my teens and mobile phones first came out, and we were, it was a big deal that anybody could have a mobile phone, let alone a personal computer, etc. So the shifts and the changes that we see have almost sort of, we've lived through these shifts and changes. And yet, if we look at decades worth of behavior in in and around the world, and as you call it, the shocks or encroaching on the land of other species that also exist. We've almost never really thought twice about that. We've just gone ahead and created and sort of plowed through what we wanted to.
Yeah, that's the key thing. Again, in a funny way, cybersecurity, which exists because we increased what in cyber we call the attack surface, that is all those different means of automated calculation that we use now. It is going back to that calculus that the more we create stuff that is going to help us, if we don't see, of course, all the potential negative effects, then it's going to create more problems.
So it's the negative effects, really.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is sort of, even through your cybersecurity work, you've sort of started to recognize there are these sorts of almost ways of seeing how the negative impacts or how you measure these sort of negative shocks can lead to a larger sort of perspective, right? Like exactly. A map of how things, almost like a formula.
Exactly, and I'll go back a little bit on that, how we can try to think about that. But so we have an environment that we're creating, this so-called Anthropocene, but that goes way beyond actually the ecological impact, because we do see the medical impact. And we do see also in that Anthropocene the fact that we're creating now an environment of computerized system, very soon robotic system that is going to really create a more, what we call in cyber kinetic effect. That is a bug that you see in the software is going to create a problem in real life, with mechanical systems and energy, in real life energy.
Wow.
But even more importantly than that, and this whole volatile environment that we create, something which creates even more danger is actually the instability that we've instilled within human societies.
Instability that we've instilled in human
societies. And that actually can be summed up in one keyword that we've already heard a lot, but we see more and more studies that show the importance of that, and that is inequalities or social inequalities. This is actually an old story. And I would refer to a fantastic book by American historian Walter Shidle. The title is The Great Leveler. And The Great Leveler is actually the story of many different human societies, from our first time as hunter-gatherers to the antiquity, Chinese antiquity, Roman antiquity, to medieval times, to now in the 20th century. And basically, there's one common thread all across those different times, historical times for us as a human species and different civilization. And there is, again, inequalities. The story is that all across time span, human societies have never been able to correct an extreme increase in inequalities. The only moment that inequalities could be corrected were basically because you'd have social revolutions, people on the low rank of societies saying, I'm fed up, and taking arms, or international warfare, and this is actually what we experienced with World War II,
complete wipe out.
Pandemics.
Interesting. So that he also wrote about pandemics.
Yeah. Absolutely. Great example in the UK of a moment where peasants all of a sudden got a better hand in negotiating with the nobility is after actually the Great Plague of the 14th century, because you'd have half or even more than that the number of peasants who were killed, but whoever was left, all of a sudden had a better bargaining power against the local nobilities. Okay. But what does that mean is that so far we've been able to correct the wrongs of social inequalities that create inside human society lots of ingrained violence. We've been able to correct that only but with huge bursts of violence. And the problem is that, as in our human development, we've reached since August 1945. And even more so since 1949, actually, a threshold in terms of human development, which is the nuclear development. And we've seen already back in the 1930s, and we see that again now, how social inequalities beget political instability, and political instability then beget diplomatic international instability that can lead us to war. And the problem with war, in 2030s or in the 2020s, is that right now, too many countries do have nuclear weapons. So that creates a very unstable environment. There's one story just to spook everyone. If people haven't
Please
heard
don't
of
spook
that,
everyone too much.
please. Well, I'm sorry. I'm a bit of a spooker here. But there's one bit of a tale that encapsulates all that, and that's what's called the Fermi Paradox. So if people don't know the Fermi Paradox, it's based on a story that talks about Enrico Fermi back in 1950s, when he was in the early 1950s, when he was working as a head researcher at the Livermore Laboratory for Nuclear Research. And among his group of friends, every time at lunch, he would ask big enigma, big questions. And there was one day when there was this, it was the moment of a flying saucer craze, the early 1950s. And on the New Yorker, there was this little vignette of a small Martian coming down from a flying saucer with two suitcases and,
his little hat.
A little hat and little, suitcases. Hello, Earth, here
I'm a
for
tourist.
tourism. And Enrico Fermi asked the question to his friends, why we don't see them yet? Because already at that time, he had the intuition.
As in extraterrestrials haven't arrived yet.
Why,
Or what, haven't we seen
look around,
sort of knock on the door of...
And we don't see them. That was based already on the intuition, which was then further actually demonstrated, that actually there's no only planets in our stellar system, but there are many different planets elsewhere. And if you have gazillion and billions of planets elsewhere, there's a high chance that life may have existed, emerged somewhere else. And that our human civilization, our development, our technological development is not a linear process. It's pretty much a power curve. That, for example, 90% of all inventions that we know were created in the 20th century. And the increase is going to be probably also at different order of magnitudes, each different centuries, now perhaps even each different decades. That means that if there was one extraterrestrial civilization that emerged maybe just 1,000 years or 10,000 years before us, and that's not much with regards to the universe, which is about 14 billion years old, then that civilization or those civilizations should be, all across the universe. They would have built up huge civilization and be everywhere. And when we look up at the skies, we would easily see them. The whole skies should be enlightened by all those guys. Mm-hmm. When you look at the skies today and you look for actually radio signals, you don't find anything.
Is it because they're maybe not using radio signals?
So there are solutions to that paradox. Fermi stated that we don't see them because interstellar traveling is quite hard. But already at that time, people thought, I don't believe that much a solution. Actually, Carl Sagan came up with a good solution, but which is a very dire solution, which is that basically all those super intelligent civilizations, actually, at inception, they are animal civilization. And animals, by definition, to survive, they kill. So they've processed and learned and behaved to kill to survive. Now, when you have too much of an explosion of technology and energy, and you still somehow deep down an animal, then you don't really control that, and boom, all thing explodes. And those animal civilizations that become very intelligent very quickly, their lifespan is just too short.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost as if the intelligence that they have destroys them.
Exactly.
So they have like a time span, which is really fascinating. Yes. Which could then lead to a very interesting sort of loop. Like civilization has a very specific and a small window to operate between. And if it gets too smart for itself, it basically destroys itself.
Exactly. And perhaps the fact that whenever you look up at the sky and you don't see any Eta Joes in space signs out there, it's because maybe all of them have actually disappeared because they could not sustain the huge development of technology and energy and intelligence.
Or perhaps that they've gone beyond what we've ever achieved, and we're still quite young in our capabilities, perhaps.
So
I mean,
yeah,
that's a really good question. So there's almost as if and Guy, I'm really keen to sort of understand one of in our previous discussion, you have mentioned the work of Spinoza, which I thought was really fascinating, and this is the reason why I got really excited talking about the universality as well as the eternal. Could you add a little bit more of the context that Spinoza, in his ethics and in his work, had actually started to challenge, and how that relates to the sort of the ecological movement that we're seeing today as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now we have a problem. Earth will withstand any shocks, but we as a species, we may destroy Earth for us, and we may destroy ourselves. All right, so the problem is how we're going to survive. And there are different elements in the toolbox actually to help us survive. So one big one, and that goes to risk management by Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza told us that there are two different ways to see the world, basically. You can ever look at things subspecies durationis, under the auspices of just the time right now, and in a way, in a very incomplete ways, right? You have the small time that you're around, or you can try to look at stuff subspecies aeternitatis, which is under the view of eternity, and I would say also universality. Basically, Spinoza engaged us to look at the world as if we were looking like God, which for Spinoza is basically a code name to talk about nature, because at his time he couldn't just say that his God wasn't exactly the God that everybody was thinking about at the time. His God is pretty much the laws of nature, basically. But what he forces and asks us to look at things really in a universal way and in a long time span under eternity, because this is where you'll see most of stuff. And I revert that to cyber risk management and risk management in general. If you look at things, say, with long view, evidently you will see the risks and you will understand them. If you look at things at a very subspecies durationis, at very short time span, then there are lots of things that you will not see. And if you don't see them, you will not prepare yourself to them. And if later on they happen, then you're screwed.
It's sort of like single-use plastics, short term, very, very, very short term. It's like, I'll use it now. I mean, it serves my purpose right now. The consequences of such have led to, tons and tons of waste being in our global commons, which is really fascinating. So that's a sort of like the eternal and the comparison with the
really. And the interesting thing is that right now, and it's emerging, you do have on the markets actually investors that, because of the investing philosophy and the way they do that, basically the equity trackers funds and people who have decided to diversify themselves to the max and just replicate indexes and the whole markets, they've reduced by this super diversification any exposure to specific risk of companies, but they've increased the effective exposure to societal risks. And when those guys do have to invest for retirement funds out of 30 years, now they start thinking about not eternity, but at least
a longer duration.
Yes. And that's why all of a sudden you have a couple of large trackers funds and also insurance companies that have started to see the issues with global warming. So global warming, if you look at things only for the next 5 years, who cares, really? Okay,
well, you have no reason. I mean, the number of companies that would say, well, it doesn't really impact us. Don't worry about it. We're not really too worried about it. It doesn't affect our supply chain.
right now. It doesn't affect
well, it doesn't affect our supply chain. I mean,
in a
that's the
short
thing,
time
though. They're
span.
not really thinking about the fact that this is short or long term. As far as they're concerned, they're sort of like their viewpoint is in front of them and they're making decisions based on that.
Yeah.
They're making decisions based on the fact that they, as far as they're concerned, cannot see the reason why they should consider the environment.
True. But you see, when they don't think, actually, it's because they've not made the effort, the conscious effort to extend their long view, which de facto is they're thinking short term. The de facto view of all of us, because it's a matter of energy efficiency and not try to use too much of our brain because we need to use it to other stuff. It's just to look short term. But if we look short term, then we're not thinking subspecie aeternitatis, and then we're missing the big risks.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
And so the other thing is, all right, so okay, extend my stuff. So how do I see all those risks? That's where you actually have to look at the nightmares.
I love this point that you've made, before as well. Like this nightmares piece for me is a showstopper. The fact that we, for so long, it's almost part of this Disneyfication of life, right? The fact that, look at the dreams. Why would you want to look at a nightmare? That's a miserable fact that, you just don't need to think about, don't need to be concerned with. So tell us more, nightmares.
Well, I go back to say design thinking. If the heart of design thinking is not, okay, let's make great stuff because I like it. The heart of design thinking is identifying problems or frictions, and then fixing them. And once you have the right solution, the easiest, the costless solution, you've done your job. But initially, you try to fix things. And that's how you make the world better. I mean, even in Jewish tradition, you talk of tikkun olam, which is you first identify the problems, and it's because you're going to fix the problems that you're going to make the world better.
Right.
The same thing with long-term view and long-term thinking. You're here to fix the big problems. But if you don't want to look at them, you'll not see them.
If you don't look at them, if you don't care about the nightmares, if you don't look at the risks, if you don't look at the long-term consequences.
If you just look at desirable future because it's cool and it's nice and it's cutie, then forget about it. Actually, this shortcut is not going to help make the world better. You'll be part of a problem. The right thing is to look and identify all the major nightmares that will come to you, and then you start thinking about how you're going to fix things. So now, an interesting fact is that using imagination, analytical thinking, and actually history, you can look at actually most of the nightmares that may come. I really take I totally disagree with the concept of black swan, which is once in a while something that had very low probability and paf, here it comes. I think it's much more interesting to think of gray rhinos, the concept of Michel Vicker. Because when you come to think about it, most of the big shocks that could happen to mankind, we know them, we've seen them, we've identified them. Pandemics, you look at, not the last 20 years, but last 100, 150 years, which is actually a good time span for any Western states or any modern state. There have been already plenty of pandemics, back 1918 flu and so forth. Financial panics. And you look at the last 100 years, you had financial panics in the 1890s, and then, of course, 1929 and so forth. We had lots of stories of financial wars, global wars we've had. Okay, so we need to forget somehow or defocus about, I think, the wrong concept of black swan, which is, hey, it's that long wind, the tail, and how are we going to get that? No, most of the big risks, we know them. We look at history, we use a bit of imagination, we develop a bit of creative risk, but we can see them. And then we try to move forward and we try to value and simulate them. And that's actually how you start having a really workable toolbox that is going to help us avoid all those big shocks to come and help us to survive. Because at the end of the day, the main job for our species is to survive.
I'm going to stop us there because we're almost at time, Guy-Philippe. But the thing is that there is just so much to go into, and we haven't even touched your minimum viable shock theory, which I think is an absolute killer. So we're definitely going to have to do a part 2 here. Guy, it's been absolutely incredible to have you on the show.
Here,
and I'm going to share your Twitter handle just in case anybody wants to be in touch with you. I'm also going to share, and I'll put into the notes as well, your link tree so that people can find out more information about you. And please give us some love and join us on Replenish Earth YouTube. If you subscribe, then we get our own very own sort of following that we can update you every time we're going to be going live, and various other projects that we're up to. So Guy, I'm going to have to stop us there, but we're going to do some short videos and people will get a few very interesting questions answered. So please watch this space. Guy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tia. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.